They wrapped the newborn in cloth and dug a second hole, just in case. It sounds shocking, maybe even cruel, but in the Middle Ages, that was normal. Expected even. But why? What could possibly make half of all babies disappear before their lives had even begun? The answers aren't just tragic, they're deeply disturbing and rarely discussed. But to understand, we have to go back to the beginning. BBBville childbirth wasn't just risky. It was a game of chance where the stakes were life or death. Most births happened right at home, in dim, fire-lit rooms with shadows dancing on stone walls, the air thick with smoke and tension. The person guiding the birth, usually a local midwife. No degree, no textbook, just knowledge passed down from trial, error, and experience. She worked with whatever tools were at hand, kitchen knives, sewing scissors, and scraps of rags that had seen too much life and not enough soap. Cleaning those tools between uses, that wasn't a thing. Germs weren't understood, let alone feared. If bacteria could book vacations, medieval birthing rooms would have been their favorite destination. Infections spread like wildfire when one dirty instrument was used on mother after mother. When something went wrong during labor, and it often did, there were no emergency C-sections, no life-saving interventions. Breech births, where a baby comes out feet first, often fatal, an umbilical cord wrapped around the neck, no quick solution. Deliveries went wrong more often than they went right. And when they did go wrong, survival wasn't a given. It was more like a miracle. Premature babies in particular stood almost no chance. No incubators, no oxygen tanks, no neonatal ICU, just a fire in the corner, some cloth for swaddling, and hope. The plan was simple: survive or don't. And most didn't. The numbers are brutal. Many places, 30 to 50% of babies died before turning one. That meant out of 10 children born, maybe 5 would make it to see their first winter. The first week alone was a nightmare. Complications that modern doctors could treat in minutes were death sentences in the 1300s. And yet, surviving birth was only the first round. The next battle came quickly, and it hit just as hard. Because staying alive meant eating. And that wasn't easy either. Feeding a newborn sounds simple enough, right? Just give him milk. But in the medieval world, breastfeeding wasn't always possible. Mothers often died during childbirth, or fell ill, or just didn't produce enough milk. If there was no mother to nurse the child, families had to get creative fast. Wealthy families could sometimes hire wet nurses, women who had recently given birth and were still producing milk. But good wet nurses were rare. It's really rare, and not all of them were safe. Some carried infections, some didn't take proper care of the baby, some simply weren't available. So people turned to animal milk, cow's milk, goat's milk, even strange broths. But those weren't made for human babies, and often they were contaminated. Bacteria, spoiled ingredients, or just indigestible proteins could spell disaster for a fragile newborn gut. Then came pap, a mixture of bread soaked in milk or water until it turned to mush. This was a popular fallback. But pap lacked the nutrients babies needed to grow strong. Imagine trying to run a marathon on maple syrup. That's what feeding pap to a baby was like. The tools they used for feeding, usually bowls, scraps of cloth, or makeshift nipples made from animal bladders or cloth bags. None of it was sterilized. And without refrigeration, milk spoiled quickly, especially in the warmer months. Feeding a baby wasn't nurturing. It was a gamble. Sometimes it was a fatal one. But even deeper than the physical challenges was something harder to admit: emotional detachment. Because in a world where infant death was common, families had to protect their hearts. It wasn't unusual for parents to delay baptizing their newborns, not because they didn't care about religion, but because they didn't want to hold a ceremony for a baby who might die before the week was out. Why buy tickets to a show if you're not sure the star will even survive rehearsal? Names were delayed too. Today, parents agonize over baby names for months. Back then, many babies were simply called little one or child until they'd proven they could survive. Naming them too early was like claiming ownership of a candle in a windstorm. It might blow out before you even lit it. This emotional distance created a deep spiritual conflict for medieval Christians. The church taught that babies who died unbaptized couldn't enter heaven, So families found themselves torn, trying to guard their own hearts, while wrestling with the idea that their child's soul might be damned. The official records reflect this brutal reality. Many infants who died were recorded simply as child or unnamed. No identity, no legacy, just a short, silent existence. But this wasn't coldness. It was a survival tactic. Loving every baby like they'd live forever would have broken people beyond repair. Imagine losing child after child after child. The emotional toll was unimaginable, and all of that heartbreak. It was just the beginning. Because while families struggled with feeding, naming, and mourning their babies, the very homes they lived in were working against them in invisible, lethal ways. Medieval homes, by today's standards, were death traps, not by intention, but by ignorance. People didn't know what was killing their children. They just called it fate. Start with water. Clean drinking water was incredibly rare. Most families got their supply from rivers or shallow wells. These were frequently polluted with human waste, dead animals, or industrial runoff, especially near towns. Think of your local creek after a big storm. Now imagine that's your baby's only drinking source. Waste disposal, practically non-existent. People just threw their garbage and bodily waste out the window or into the street. Privies were basic holes in the ground, often dangerously close to homes and water sources. Sanitation wasn't just poor, it was catastrophic. Inside the house wasn't much better. Floors were dirt, literally. Sometimes covered with straw or rushes that soaked up everything. Spilled food, vomit, urine. Over time, these floors turned into bacteria breeding grounds. They were never cleaned, just replaced every few months with fresh straw dumped right on top of the mess. And then there were the creatures: rats, mice, lice, fleas, not occasional pests, permanent roommates. They lived in the walls, the floors, the bedding. They left droppings everywhere and carried diseases we still fear today. Babies who began to crawl weren't exploring, they were surviving in a microbial war zone. Every surface held danger. Flies carried filth from outdoor latrines to cooking pots. Parasites nested in bedding, and no one really understood what was happening. This filthy environment created the perfect storm for something even worse than poor sanitation. Disease. Not just one or two, but waves of invisible killers that could wipe out families within days. Diseases in the medieval world didn't whisper, they roared. And when they came for babies, they didn't knock, they just barged in. Imagine living in a place where even the smallest cough could be a death sentence, where a rash might mean your baby wouldn't make it to the end of the week. That's what medieval families faced. With no vaccines, no antibiotics, and almost no understanding of how illnesses spread, infection was a constant invisible enemy. One of the most feared childhood killers? Measles. Today, it's preventable. But in the Middle Ages, it was a horror. It swept through villages like fire through dry grass. Once it got in, it didn't leave quietly. It caused high fevers, painful rashes, and complications that could lead to pneumonia or even brain swelling. Entire families would fall ill, but the smallest ones, the babies, died first. Fast. Then there was smallpox. This disease didn't discriminate. Rich or poor, baby or adult, it attacked without mercy, covered its victims in painful blisters, inside and out. About 30% of those infected died, and the survivors, scarred for life, literally. Their skin left pitted and rough. A baby that lived through smallpox was a fighter, but the battle always left marks. Whooping cough was another cruel one, its signature symptom. A deep, rattling cough that made it sound like the child was gasping for air. For babies whose airways are so small, this wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Their tiny lungs couldn't take the strain. Then came pneumonia and bronchitis. Today, a round of antibiotics might clear it up in a week. But back then, there were no antibiotics. No way to drain fluid from the lungs. No way to stop the slow suffocation that came with it. And we haven't even mentioned the monster in the dark. The Black Death, the 14th century plague that killed over a third of Europe. It didn't matter how old you were, if you caught it, the odds were brutal. Whole families gone in a matter of days. Babies, children, mothers, fathers, buried in mass graves. But the dangers weren't always so dramatic. Sometimes they were as small as a scratch, A baby might cut their foot on a splintered floorboard. A mother might nick herself during childbirth. In a world without antibiotics or antiseptics, those tiny wounds could get infected. Tetanus, sepsis, blood poisoning, all lurking in the background, waiting for their chance. It wasn't just that the world was dangerous, it was that no one had the tools to understand why. So families coped the only way they could. They adapted. They built systems, made choices, adjusted their hopes. But some of those adaptations were hard to imagine. Like swaddling, for example. In theory, it was a way to keep babies safe, wrapped tight in cloth strips like little bundles. People believed it helped their bones grow straight, that it prevented self-injury. And for working mothers, it had one more benefit. It kept babies quiet. But not all swaddling was done with care. Some babies were wrapped so tightly they could barely breathe. Their limbs went numb. Their chests couldn't rise fully. In trying to protect their children, some families accidentally did harm. It wasn't cruelty, it was desperation. A mother in the field couldn't keep a constant eye on her baby. Swaddling gave her a chance to work, knowing the baby wouldn't wander off or cry loudly enough to attract predators. The choice was never between perfect and bad. It was always between bad and worse. Meanwhile, childcare in the medieval world was a family affair, but not in the way we think of today. Babysitters, daycares. Not even a concept. If a baby wasn't being held by their mother, they were often handed off to a sibling. Sometimes as young as 10 or 12, imagine a child barely old enough to tie their shoes being responsible for a newborn. That was reality. And those same young caregivers had other duties too. Fetching water, tending animals, helping in the kitchen. Baby care was one task among many, not always the priority. The architecture of medieval life made things harder too. Most families lived in cramped homes, 1 or 2 rooms total. Multiple generations under one roof. Parents, grandparents, children, babies, sometimes even servants or animals. All sleeping in the same space. Privacy didn't exist. Quiet didn't either. In that chaos, watching a single child, let alone giving them focused care, was nearly impossible. Babies cried themselves to sleep. Some were fed on schedules that depended on the family's chores, not the child's needs. It wasn't neglect out of cruelty, it was neglect out of necessity. The math of survival was relentless. In a world where food was never guaranteed, and every mouth was another expense, families had to make impossible choices. Which child gets the last bowl of stew? Which one gets the thicker blanket during a harsh winter? These decisions were real, and they happened every day. It's not that medieval parents didn't love their children, they did fiercely, but they were also realists. When resources were scarce, they prioritized the kids who had already proven they could survive. A 3-year-old had a better shot than a newborn. So that's where the food went. That's where the attention went. It's a brutal way of thinking, but it was necessary. It's like watering the healthiest plants in a drought and letting the weaker ones wither. Not because you wanted to, it's because you had no choice. And then there was birth control or the complete lack of it. Babies kept coming, whether families were ready or not. High birth rates weren't always a sign of hope. They were a survival strategy. You had 10 kids because you expected 5 would die. The constant arrival of new infants wasn't always greeted with joy. Sometimes it came with dread. Overcrowded homes, overworked parents, underfed children, it all created a cycle that seemed impossible to break. And at the center of that storm, babies. Vulnerable, fragile, dependent. Born into a world that wasn't ready to keep them safe. This reality reshaped entire cultures. Communities adapted to loss by normalizing it. Parents learned to withhold affection until a child had proven they could survive. Not because they didn't care, but because the pain of loving and losing was too much to bear. They buried their grief quietly, moved on quickly. Because they had to. And yet the miracle is that some babies did survive. Against the odds. Despite the infections, the cold, the hunger, the neglect, despite everything, they lived. And they grew. But for every one of those children who saw their second birthday, there were others who didn't even see their second week, their second day. This is the story of medieval infancy, not just as a medical tragedy, but as a reflection of the world it happened in. A world full of hardship, yes, but also resilience. For medieval families, the greatest enemy wasn't just disease, poor sanitation, or even hunger. It was the overwhelming limitations of the world itself. Every part of life, every structure of society made proper infant care nearly impossible. Love wasn't lacking. Knowledge was. Parents weren't heartless. They were trapped by their environment, their tools, and their time. Survival wasn't a choice. It was a battlefield. Babies were the smallest, most fragile soldiers in a war no one had the map for. Think about a typical medieval parent. They woke up before the sun, worked until after it set, and rarely had time to rest. Whether they were farming, smithing, weaving, or selling goods, they were constantly in motion. Feeding a family, heating a home, mending tools, it all took hours of physical labor. There were no days off, no sick days, and definitely no parental leave. So, what happened to the baby while mom and dad worked? The answer? Improvisation. Sometimes the baby was strapped to a parent's back while they worked in the fields. Sometimes they were left in a cradle near the fire, checked on between chores. Other times, a slightly older sibling, maybe 5 or 6 years old, was responsible for watching the baby, keeping them quiet, keeping them fed. This patchwork of caretaking wasn't ideal. But in a world without options, it was the only way to survive. And when you add up all the obstacles, dangerous births, deadly diseases, filthy environments, lack of food, emotional detachment, it becomes clear why infant survival rates were so dismal. But here's the part that's often forgotten. Every baby that survived changed everything. Because surviving childhood in medieval Europe wasn't just a personal victory, it was a statistical anomaly. A child who lived past age 5 had already dodged more threats than most people face in a lifetime today. And that survival changed how families viewed them. They were no longer just potential. They were investment. Someone worth naming. Someone worth teaching. Someone worth betting on. These children often grew up fast. Childhood wasn't protected or prolonged. Kids worked, learned trades, helped raise siblings, and carried responsibility from a young age. But those who reached adulthood, they became part of a lineage that had fought generation after generation to keep going. We like to think of the past as either romantic or brutal, but it was both. And nowhere is that clearer than in the life and death of medieval infants, because these tiny lives, so often cut short, shaped the decisions, the beliefs, and the resilience of entire communities. They influenced religious rituals. Baptisms were delayed not out of laziness, but out of bitter wisdom. Why rush to christen a soul that might be gone before the priest arrived? They changed language and literature. You won't find many medieval lullabies. Too many babies never woke up again. The emotional landscape of the Middle Ages was painted in loss, and everyone rich or poor had a brush in their hand. And they changed how people understood time itself. For us, a year goes by in the blink of an eye. But in medieval life, making it to a first birthday was a monumental achievement. Families celebrated cautiously, often quietly, but with deep unspoken gratitude. That's the thing about medieval infancy. It teaches us how deeply human beings will fight for life, even when the odds are stacked against them. It reveals a level of resilience that modern comfort has, in some ways, made us forget. These weren't people who gave up. These were people who kept trying, baby after baby, year after year, in the face of unimaginable grief. They kept loving, even when love hurt. They kept naming their children, even when they feared those names might soon be carved on tombstones. They kept hoping. Because even in a world where death seemed certain, life kept happening, and not just happening, thriving. Slowly, painfully, societies learned. Midwives got better. Knowledge practices improved. Knowledge spread. Generations passed down. Wisdom learned the hard way, and infant survival rates began to climb. Today we take for granted things that would have been unthinkable blessings back then. Clean water, safe hospitals, prenatal care, antibiotics, vaccines, and yes, even diapers. We live in a world where a child's cry is rarely a death sentence, where naming a baby isn't an act of defiance, but of joy. But if we trace those blessings back far enough, they lead to the families who endured without them, to the parents who buried child after child and still tried again, to the babies who fought to live, even when everything said they shouldn't have. Medieval infancy was a crucible, fire that tested every family, every village, every generation. And from it came a humanity that refused to give in. So when we ask why did so many babies die back then, we're also asking how did anyone survive? And the answer is somehow they did, because the story of medieval babies isn't just about death, it's about resilience, endurance, and the quiet, extraordinary courage of starting again.